The rose he left. I found the rose at 6:42 a.m. on a Wednesday in May, on the porch step, in the rain. It was a single, deep red rose, the kind of rose that you cannot buy in any florist's shop in our town, because the florist's shop in our town sells pink roses, white roses, and the small yellow roses that old men bring to the cemetery. The florist does not sell red. The florist has not sold red since 2019, when my mother asked her to stop. The rose was lying on its side, against the metal railing of the porch, with the stem pointing to the left, with the petals slightly bowed toward the step. It had been there for some time. The water that gathered in the bowl of the bloom had been there since before dawn. A single ant was circling the rim, looking, very methodically, for a way in. I picked it up. I held it to my nose. It did not smell of anything. It had been weeks since it had smelled of anything. Red roses smell. Real red roses. The variety called black magic that a man can only buy from a specialty grower 3 counties north for a maximum of 9 days, and then the smell goes. The petals darken. The stem softens. The small green base of the bloom, called the calyx, hardens into a small woody knot. By the time a rose arrives on a porch step in May, having been bought in some private hour by some private hand, the rose has usually already begun the slow, irreversible process of becoming a thing you hold rather than a thing you bury your face in. The rose had been left by a man I had been married to for 26 years. His name was Theo. He was 58. He had been for the last 11 weeks asleep in a hospital bed 4 miles from our porch, in a room that looked out over a parking lot, with a window he could not see from and a door I had not been allowed past since March. The note was not attached. The note was not under the door. The note was not in the mailbox. The note was not in the glove compartment of the car he was no longer driving. The note was not in the small bowl on the kitchen counter where I kept my keys, where he used to leave his keys, where I had been looking for a note every morning since February, with the careful, slow, patient dread of a woman who has been expecting a note for 11 weeks and has not yet found it. The note was in the rose. The note was in the rose, and I did not know it yet. I stood on the porch in the rain in May, and I held the rose by its stem, with my left hand, with my right hand still on the door, and I did not know yet that the rose was not a rose. The rose was a sentence. The rose was a sentence he had been carrying since February, in a room 4 miles from the porch, with a window he could not see from. The rose was the sentence he had finally, on a Wednesday in May, finished. The rose was the only way he had been able to deliver it, but I did not know this. I was just holding a rose. The man who had stopped talking. He had stopped talking on the 3rd Tuesday of February. The doctors did not know why. The doctors had run every test, twice. The doctors had brought in the 3rd best neurologist in the state, who had spent 4 hours with him, and emerged saying only that some days the mouth forgets how to be a mouth, and that this was one of those days, and that there was no way to predict whether the forgetting was permanent, or a kind of long, waited pause. He had been a quiet man. He had been a quiet man, in the way his father had been quiet. A man who said what he meant, and then put the sentence down, and did not pick it up again. He had been a quiet man, who had read at night, who had cooked breakfast on Sundays, who had driven me to the airport with a 4-word send-off, and a thermos he had bought me in 2008, and that I had carried on every flight since. He had not been silent until February. He had been quiet. He had said, "I love you," and passed the salt, and "Where is the dog's leash?" He had said, in our marriage, on average, perhaps 900 words a day. In February, he had begun, slowly, to lose them. It had started with nouns. He had not been able to say porch, or pillow, or morning. He had worked around them, at first, with the kind of determination that makes a room very small, pointing, gesturing, smiling the apologetic smile of a man who has lost his own dictionary and is afraid of being a child in his own house. I had learned, in the first weeks, to follow his pointing. I had become, briefly, a translator. By March, he had lost the verbs. By the middle of March, he had stopped trying. He had been moved to the hospital in late March. He had been awake most days. He had been able to walk, briefly, with a walker. He had been able to read, mostly, although he had stopped reading in mid-April. He had not been able to speak. He had not, in 11 weeks, been able to say a single sentence. He had communicated with the nurses by pointing, with the doctors by nodding, with my son, who had flown in from a job in Seoul, by holding his hand. With me, he had communicated by looking. He had looked at me the way a man looks at a person when he has something to say and cannot find any of the words in any of the languages he has ever known. I had sat with him for 11 weeks. I had sat with him and I had felt, every morning, the sentence hovering just behind his mouth. I had felt it like a small, soft animal in the room, sitting on the radiator, waiting to be named. I had felt it every morning, when I had leaned forward in the chair and said, "Are you okay today?" and he had nodded. I had felt it every morning when I had said, "Is there anything you want?" And he had looked at the window he could not see from, the window that looked out over the parking lot where the hospital staff parked, where my car had been sitting, every morning, in the same spot, for 11 weeks. He had wanted to say something. I had been sure of it. He had wanted to say something he had been carrying for a long time. He had wanted to say something with his mouth. He had not been able to. He had not been able to do anything with his mouth, except drink, swallow, breathe. I had waited every morning for the sentence. I had waited every morning, knowing that the sentence was perhaps the most important sentence he had ever tried to say, and that the sentence was, perhaps, going to die in his throat before he said it. I had gone to the porch that morning at 6:42 a.m. to get the milk. The milk was in the small cooler by the door. The roses were not. The boy who had always carried things. Theo had carried things his whole life. He had carried a small, soft, brown notebook in his back pocket from the day he was 16 until the day he no longer had a back pocket to put it in. He had carried a small, soft, brown letter in his wallet from the day his mother died until the day his wallet was stolen at the airport in 2011, at which point he had asked the airline for it back and they had, surprisingly, found it for him, and he had carried the letter again. He had carried a small, soft, brown photograph of our son, our now adult son, our son who was 28 and lived in Seoul, in the back of the wallet, where the photograph could be felt, when the wallet was in the back pocket of a pair of trousers, against the small of the back. He had carried things. He had carried things in the way all of his father's people carried things, quietly, in pockets, in brown envelopes, in places that could not be seen unless a person was looking for them. He had carried things with his hands, with his arms, with his back, with the muscle memory of a man who had been given something and had decided, in the slow way a man decides, that the something would not be put down. Theo had also, in the last 11 weeks, been doing something with his hands. He had been doing, every day, a thing the doctors had noted and the nurses had noted and the speech therapist had noted and I had noted, with the careful attention of a woman who has been married to a man for 26 years and is not going to stop paying attention to his hands now that his mouth has lost its way. He had been doing, every day, a thing that was not the sentence. He had been doing, every day, a thing that I had assumed, for the first 6 weeks, was just a kind of remembered comfort. He had been doing, every day, a thing that was the sentence. The thing was small. The thing was quiet. The thing was in the way a man's hands do, in a hospital room, with no one watching, the only thing his hands have been allowed to keep. He had been making, every day, a rose. The hands that made the rose. He had been making, every day, since early March, a small, hand-folded paper rose. The nurses had told me this, in April, in the corridor, with the kind of voice a nurse uses when a nurse is telling a wife something the wife is going to need to sit down for. They had said, "You should know. He has been making something out of paper. He has been making a rose, of all things. He has been making it from the inside of an old magazine we brought him. He has been making it, very slowly, one petal at a time, with his hands. He has been refusing to let us throw away the early ones. He has a small bag at the foot of his bed. The bag has 47 of them in it. The early ones are not very good. The later ones are very good. He has not explained what he is doing." I had said, "I know." The nurse had said, "You know? I know him." The nurse had said, "He has been working on a single rose. In addition, he has been working on a single rose since early April. He has been working on the single rose, by himself, in the dark, when we are not in the room. He has been working on the single rose for almost a month. He has not let us see the single rose. He has refused to let us throw away the failed versions. He has a special bag for those. He has refused to throw out the failed versions of the special rose, too. He has a small bag for the failed versions of the special rose, and a spro." And he had stood in the corridor. I had put my hand on the wall. I had felt for the first time, in 11 weeks, exactly what his mouth had been trying to say. "He is making me a rose." The nurse had said, "I think so." I had gone back into the room. I had sat in the chair. He had been asleep. I had looked at the foot of the bed and seen the bag. The bag was a small brown paper bag, the kind you get at a pharmacy. The bag had been folded down at the top. I could see, even from the chair, the corner of something inside the bag, sticking out at an odd angle, which was the angle of a failed, half-folded petal. He had been making me a rose. He had been making me a rose, by hand, with the same patience his father had used to fold a paper boat, with the same attention his mother had used when she had mended a sock. He had been making me a rose out of the inside of a magazine, out of the only paper that had been in the room, out of nothing, in the way all the things in his family that had been loved had been made out of nothing. The rose was going to be the sentence. The rose was the only sentence his hands had been able to write. I had waited 11 weeks. I had sat in the chair and I had waited. I had not, until that morning in May, asked him to show me. I had known, with the slow, certain patience of a wife, that the rose was not yet finished. I had known that the rose would be finished when the rose was finished, and not before. He had finished the rose, somewhere between midnight and dawn, on a Wednesday in May. He had finished the rose in the dark, with his hands, in a hospital room 4 miles from our porch. He had finished the rose, and then he had done the rest. The petals I did not see yet. I stood on the porch with the rose. I did not see the petals yet. I saw the rose. I saw the deep red, the slight darkening at the edges, the small, woody calyx at the base of the bloom. I saw the stem. I saw the leaves, 3 of them, evenly spaced, slightly curled. I brought the rose inside. I put the rose in water. I set the vase on the kitchen counter, beside the bowl of keys, beside the small basket where I kept the mail, beside the brown paper bag where I kept, in another life, the receipts from his trips. He had not taken a trip in years. The paper bag had been empty for years. I did not look at the rose. I did not look at the rose the way I had been looking at roses since I was 8, the way a woman looks at a rose when she has been given a rose. I did not look at the rose's outer petals. I did not look, with my thumb, at the way the outer petals held the inner petals, in the way a rose holds its own weight, with the kinetic, anxious embrace of a flower that is also a kind of container. I looked at the rose the way a wife looks at a rose when she has been waiting 11 weeks for a sentence, and has known, since April, that the sentence is the rose. I held the rose. I held it in both hands, in the kitchen, at 6:44 a.m., with the rain still on the window, and the dog asleep by the radiator, and my son, our son, in Seoul, sleeping on the other side of the world. I held the rose. I closed my eyes. I did not yet look at the petals, the thing my hands did first. My hands did the thing his hands had done. His hands had folded the magazine page, in his hands, in the dark, in the way his father had taught him to fold a paper boat, in the way a man in his family folded a thing when the man was going to use the thing for love. His hands had folded the magazine page along the lines where the magazine had been printed. The magazine had been a copy of the New Yorker, open to an article about beekeeping. The article had been about the way bees, when they lose their queen, leave the hive, in the way bees always leave when they have no queen, in the way bees do not always return to the hive they have left. The article had been about the quiet, slow death of a colony. His hands had folded the page in half. His hands had folded the page again. His hands had folded the page into a triangle. His hands had folded the triangle into a smaller triangle. His hands had folded the triangle, again into a petal. My hands now did the petal apart. My hands did not touch the rose. My hands did not open the rose. My hands held the rose upside down, by the stem, in the same way he had held the half-finished rose at 3 a.m., 2 days before, when the nurses had walked in and he had put the rose under his pillow, and they had pretended not to see. My hands held the rose upside down. My hands felt, with the thumb of my right hand, the seam. The seam was the place where he had glued, with the small tube of glue the speech therapist had brought him, the last petal to the first. The seam was at the base of the bloom, between 2 petals that were not quite the same size. The seam was, in the way a paper rose's seam is, the most fragile part of the rose. My thumb pressed on the seam. The seam came undone, the petals, the sentence, the man who had carried the sentence. The rose opened. The rose opened the way a real rose opens, slowly, in the air, with the petals falling back, in the way a hand falls back from a fist it has been making for a long time. The rose opened in my hands, in the kitchen, in the morning, in the rain. There were 7 of them. There were 7 petals. He had folded 7 petals. Each petal was, on the outside, a deep red, the color of a magazine page that had been painted, with the small watercolor set the nurse had bought him at a thrift store, in the only colors the thrift store had. Each petal was, on the inside, the page of the magazine article about beekeeping. Each petal had, on the inside, in the small hand of a man who had been making a sentence out of the only paper he had been given, 2 words. Petals, I said to myself. 7 of them. 1 for every week he has been in the hospital. I turned the first petal over. I read the 2 words. They were written, in pencil, in the small, careful, even script my husband had been using for 36 years. Wed, 1978. I turned the second petal over. Almost, 1984. The third, your, 1991. The fourth, wedding, 2002. The fifth, our son, 2007. The sixth, my, 2014. The seventh, last, 2026. I stood in the kitchen, in the morning, with the 7 petals in my hands and the stems and the calyx and the leaf and the glue, and I stood, and I did not, for a long time, understand. Wed, 1978. He had wanted to marry me in 1978. He had been 18. He had been too young to marry. He had written to my father. My father had said no. He had written to my mother. My mother had said no. He had written to me. I had been 17. I had said yes, in a letter, in a sentence that has been in our marriage the first sentence of us, almost, 1984. He had been, in 1984, 6 months from marrying me. He had been 24, I had been 23. He had been afraid, in 1984, that I would change my mind. He had been afraid, in 1984, that my mother would change my mind. He had been afraid, in 1984, that his father would not be at the wedding. He had been afraid, in 1984, that we would not have a daughter. He had been afraid, in 1984, that we would not have a son. He had been afraid, in 1984, that the water in the pipes of the apartment we would rent would be cold. He had been afraid, in 1984, of all the things a man is afraid of in the 6 months before he becomes a husband. He had almost, in 1984, lost me. He had almost lost me, your, 1991. He had proposed, finally, in 1991. He had been 31. He had proposed in a borrowed car, on a Sunday morning, on a road in Vermont, with a ring he had bought with the last of his savings. He had not opened the box. He had just held it, in his lap, while I drove, while I did not know. He had held the box the whole way home. He had opened it at the kitchen table. He had not then asked me to marry him. He had instead handed me the box with the ring inside, with the ring not quite facing up, and had said, "This is yours." I had closed the box. I had said, "I know." He had said, "Do you want to marry me?" I had said yes. I had said yes the same way I had said it in 1978, in a letter, with a small voice, in the front of my throat. Wedding, 2002. He had been, in 2002, the man who had married me. He had been 42. He had been, in our wedding, the man who had cried at the part where I said I do. He had been, in our wedding, the man his mother had not expected him to be, the man his father had told him he was not going to be, the man his sister had not known he could be. He had been the man who had held me, in front of the small congregation of our friends, in a church we had picked because it had a single low window, and who had not, in the entire ceremony, looked away from me. Our son, 2007. We had a son in 2007. The boy had been born in the early morning,